All right, 2021 grad of the Newhouse School of Communications at Syracuse University. He will be on the call this weekend for Westwood One at the Men's College Lacrosse Final Four. Cooper Boardman, our guest on the show. Cooper, thanks for coming on. How are you today?
Oh, I'm great, Steve. I'm great, Paulie. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. And it's, I tell you what, this has been, and maybe some recency bias, but one of the best men's lacrosse tournaments that I've ever seen. Let's just go back to last weekend, the quarterfinal round. And again, I know there's some recency bias to this, but 3 of those 4 games were as good as, as good as they come. Where does that rank for you in terms of tournaments and, maybe quarterfinal rounds in particular that you've seen out of this tournament?
As good of a group of 3-4 games as I can remember since I was kind of in the sport over the last decade, and it gave me the feeling. I remember being in East Hartford for that championship between Maryland and Virginia a few years ago, and it came down to one shot off a face-off to win it, and it was saved, and Maryland found a way. And to me, that was the feeling that I was getting watching those games last week. And I really do think, you sit here, and I know we're going to get Syracuse and Maryland, and I don't need to tell anyone in that city in Syracuse what that means and what that's like. But when you look at the 4 teams here and the 2 games that we have ahead of us on Saturday, it is as good as it gets. And it's an awesome thing for the sport, guys.
You said we're going to get to Syracuse. We're going to do that right now. And, this fan base has been starved for a Final Four, first since 2013. I don't need to tell you that. But, going into that Princeton game, it kind of felt like whether or not the season was a success, fair or unfair, hinged upon whether or not they won that game, right? Because if they lose it, it's second straight year that, they were in the quarterfinal round and they were preseason number 2 and they came up short. You win it and you get that monkey off your back and the drought is over. Can you speak to what that win meant for this program to be back on Memorial Day weekend?
It meant 12 years. Truly. And it's, it's funny because it's like, you just said it, I'm class of 2021 from Syracuse. So my lacrosse season, I'm saying that in air quotes, was 2020. And that team was 5-0. They were the number 1 team in the country. They had just destroyed Johns Hopkins on the road in Baltimore. And as we were on our way back from Baltimore to Syracuse, we found out that the students were going home, and we didn't know if there was going to be any more season or anything. And obviously, you guys know the rest of that story, right? And that's my story. That's just 1 year of it. And I think about that, and then I think about that. Some kind of like that story over 12 years, right? From 2014 all the way to 2024. And that's what, everybody has experienced. And everybody in a different part of Syracuse history has their story. And if you're a Syracuse lacrosse fan, you have a story that is every year since 2014. And so I think that, again, every team is its own thing. This team is in many ways nothing but the 2025 team, and in itself deserves to be its own wonderful story. But I felt it just watching that game and felt kind of like the 2020 version of myself watching that game. And I know for a fact there are a lot of Syracuse lacrosse fans that felt the same way.
So this team closed the regular season with 3 straight losses, and then they went down to Charlotte, needing a win to feel good about their chances. They were probably going to make the tournament anyway, but they needed to beat Notre Dame to lock in a berth. They did, and we know what's happened since then. They've won 4 straight games, 3 of those in a row by a single goal. What has changed, Cooper, from the end of the regular season to this run, or is it just a case of a bounce going here or there, in their favor, and is it seems like there's a fine line between winning and losing in the sport, especially this year.
Well, I think this week, you go play Maryland, and obviously when you do that, you go look back on the first time you play a team, right? And you go back to that meeting with Maryland, and Gary Gates sat on the podium, and the last 2 sentences he said were, "We need to learn how to win. We need to learn how to win." And, talent is one thing, but, you talk to coaches, and you guys know, you're around sports, enough to know that that's a real thing, right? Like teams have to learn how to deal with the pressure moment, how to be the team that actually wins the 1-goal game. And, whatever has happened, it is so unbelievably clear that this team has learned how to win. And I'll tell you this, I mean, you look around and I'm obviously around all these other teams between Cornell and Penn State and obviously Maryland on the other side. And these are all teams that have had kind of their own individual journeys of learning how to win. Syracuse is probably the craziest of the four because it does feel like a switch just flipped instantly, but they did. And it's not an accident about, when you look at the way they've played over these last few games.
Now, this opponent is as tough as it comes, I think, for Syracuse in particular. Maryland's beaten them 7 straight times. We all know, John Tillman's record when he's got a week to prepare, and his record in the semifinals rather is remarkable. What is it about this team and their style of play that gives Syracuse so much trouble?
Well, it's their system, right? And John Tillman is like, and just having talked to him these last few years, because they're always in championship weekend, this is a savant, right? Like, this is a guy who has a system, believes in the system, and obviously we know the results of the system, but they're so process-oriented. They want to slow the game down. They're fine with losing the possession. They do all the things that you wouldn't want to do in lacrosse on paper necessarily, right? Slow pace, opposite of Syracuse. Low possession games, opposite of Syracuse. They lose possession battles and win games, opposite of Syracuse. They're okay with that. And the question on Saturday, guys, that I'm sure you've been asking it all week, and I'm sure everybody is too, in that city, is which style of play are we actually going to see on Saturday afternoon? Is this going to be Maryland, slow it down, make it ugly, probably going to be raining, definitely going to be cold, or is this going to be, Ferrari sports car Syracuse that we saw on a sunny day at Long Island last week against Princeton? And I don't know the answer sitting here at 12:55 on Thursday.
What does this game come down to? Is it whether or not Syracuse can get off to a good start and try to dictate the tempo? Or does it come down to something else in your mind?
To me, it's possessions. Syracuse led the nation in possessions this year, and I do think John Mullen from the face-off spot is going to be massive, and it's not to me it's not that much deeper. Maryland's going to get their stops. I think we as a Syracuse fan, you probably have to understand that this is not going to be a 19-goal game, right? And so. From that perspective, you're going to need a lot of possessions to score enough to win against this team. And, we'll see. And they didn't shoot well first meeting out. I think they'll shoot better. I think the Joey Spalita that we saw, the rest of the attack that we saw, the Finn Thompson that we saw, the other day against Princeton is a little bit closer to what we'll see on Saturday. But they need to have the ball to have any shot against the Maryland team that would be just fine with this game being, 8-7, 9-8.
Let's talk about the other matchup if we could. Cornell, Penn State. Penn State is responsible for Cornell's only loss this year. It was kind of an odd end to that game, right? There was an unreleasable penalty. Penn State scored a flurry of goals at the end of regulation, forced overtime, and then won it in overtime. Was that a fluke, or do you think Penn State is more than capable of beating the Big Red?
Well, I think the final 2.5 minutes of that game, I wouldn't call it a fluke, but, as you just put it, like that's a situation that's incredibly unique, and I don't think it's any deeper than that again. But, then you dive into the numbers in that game. That's the fewest possessions in a game that Cornell's had all year long. How do you stop C.J. Kirst? How do you stop the best offense in the country, the highest shooting percentage in the country, the most weapons in the country? You don't let them have the ball. It's kind of the same Syracuse-Maryland conversation, and Penn State did that. They're going to have to win a ton of face-offs. They did do that. They were, right around 59, 60% in that first meeting. But I do think probably of these 4 teams, and look, we know what Cornell is. Syracuse has had this wonderful run over the last few weeks. Maryland, is the gold standard in so many ways over the last decade plus under John Tillman. Penn State is the one that, like, nobody, I feel like, is quite talking about enough. And this is a team that's won a lot of big games. They beat Cornell, as you said, early in the year. They beat a very good Colgate team. I don't think I need to tell you guys how good Colgate is. They beat Notre Dame, the two-time defending champions. And I do think that there's a lot of value to the idea that Jeff Tambroni on championship weekend is underrated again. And I do think that game is going to be a lot closer than maybe people think it's going to be here.
Yeah, and Jeff Tambroni going back to Foxborough. That, of course, was the venue and the location of that 2009 championship that slipped away in the final seconds of regulation. Then Syracuse won it in overtime. So a lot of storylines. Obviously Tambroni going up against his former team. A lot of storylines there. You mentioned C.J. Kirst. He has the Twarton locked up, right? Regardless of what happens, is he winning that award? You've seen a lot of great lacrosse players, doing this, as you said, since you've been, following the sport for the last decade or so. Where does he kind of rank? I mean, he's phenomenal and obviously the leading goal scorer in Division I history.
I think what's cool, and we're going to have our meetings with them tomorrow, and I'm excited to sit across from him and just learn a little bit about what makes him tick, because by all accounts, from everybody that I trust in lacrosse, and you read articles and all this, like, we're talking about a Michael Jordan. I really mean this, like a Michael Jordan level of psychotic. And I mean that in the most complimentary way possible. Like, we see the results, and the goals, speak for themselves. 76 of them, leading scorer of the country, all-time leading scorer in NCAA history. All that's great, and all that's real. But we're talking about an extraordinary competitor, like, just in a way that, and everyone's competitive and everyone's really good, and he's beyond that. There's a story about him playing basketball in the driveway with one of his older brothers, and he beats his older brother in basketball, and his older brother's crying, and their dad takes the brother, again, who's older than TJ, in and sits him down and says, hey, don't worry about it. CJ's just a little different. He's just wired a little differently. And that's the guy that we've seen this year and over the last few years. And I also do think that, we could talk about all the teams and everything. On the biggest stage in the sport, with the best player in the sport, with that kind of competitive drive over one, maybe two games, I think that if you're a fan of sports, it's something that you're going to want to watch and listen to.
All right, Cooper, I know you're on the call, so I won't ask you for a prediction, but this was great with the insight. We'll see you there. I'm coming there to cover it from a Channel 9 perspective, so it should be a great weekend. We will have the games right here on ESPN Radio, beginning with the noon semifinal game on Saturday. Cooper, thanks so much for coming on.
Can't wait. Appreciate you guys having me, and I bring the raincoat, Steve.
Yes, I will. It's already packed. Already packed, ready to go. Cooper Boardman, our guest here on the program. And with that...
you can catch his call right here.
That's right.
Tim Leonard's on TK.
That's right. We'll hit a timeout. Hour number 1 in the books. We'll kick off hour number 2 next on ESPN.